we should be very, very careful concerning the Gulf states. Yes, we can find, common interests, but we should remember all the time that we really rely on a completely different set of values. And we should not overemphasize this relationship, although I think that anything we can do to improve them, well, that's very, very important.
Varsha, Yair Golan talking about a difference in values between Israel and some of these countries. Very appropriate now on a day that Time magazine named Jamal Khashoggi one of its People of the Year. That murder, that case shows perhaps the difference in values, and of course the Netanyahu government, one of the few that has not openly condemned Saudi Arabia. So there is a problematic side to also for Israel in these growing ties.
I think that's a very valid point to raise. I think that on both sides, in Israel and in the Gulf, there are definitely actors who are applying the brakes a little bit, because it is true that while there are shared strategic interests at play, the values that these different states are operating out of can be very different. And this is also not to mention that there are decades of animosity between Israel and the Gulf states that are only now getting resolved. And that's likely going to take some time to work through. So yes, absolutely. Is there an element of overexcitement? Is there an element of maybe reading into this a little bit too much? I think that that's a possibility, simply because these moves from the Gulf states towards Israel have been so unprecedented that it's hard not to take not to take these moves to mean more than they really are. But that said, there's always that big looming gut check of not just divergent values, perhaps between Israel and the Gulf states, but that block of Palestine being in the middle. As long as that's there, that's likely the biggest difference between Israel and Gulf states.
I want to bring this back to security in Iran for a moment, because if we're doing a reality check, this is a key issue. Giorgio, earlier you were talking about how the closening between Israel and the Gulf is in part due to a decline of U.S. influence in the Middle East. But we see at the same time President Trump, this administration, talking tough all the time about Iran. They're announcing new sanctions. They really at least paint their policy as being an extremely hardline policy on Iran. Do you think that the opposite is actually happening practically in the Middle East?
I think it's important to see this within the context of the previous administration. President Barack Obama certainly tried to move U.S. and Iran towards at least a partial rapprochement. And because U.S. has relied on the Gulf states and Israel to counter Iran for a long time, this left the Gulf states and Israel very worried about what role they would play in U.S. foreign policy. There's no doubt that Trump, with his very anti-Iranian foreign policy, is doing things which may seem like very, very beneficial to the perspective of Israel and some of the anti-Iranian Gulf states. But at the same time, Iran keeps on ascending as a power, gaining more influence, and Trump's not going to be president forever. There could be a future U.S. president who takes a very different approach to Iran. At the same time, it might be going out on a little bit of a limb here, but let's remember Trump is unpredictable. He's unhinged. He's very brash. And he's totally transactional. We didn't think that he would be speaking well of the North Korean dictator, but then he did. Perhaps he will strike who knows, the so-called deal of the century with Iran, and he'll be speaking very positively about Rouhani in his second term. It takes a Nixon to go to China. I think people in the Middle East who are intelligent are very aware that this is possible, and therefore I think Israel sees it in its interest to try to improve relations with all governments in the region that have a similar view of Iran, or at least are taking action against Iran. That also includes Sudan, by the way. Right. So I really think that the decline of U.S. influence is going to continue, and no matter what we're going to try to see the Israelis and the Arab Gulf states try to continue finding some common ground, even though it's a very sensitive topic for the reasons that the other guests have mentioned.
And Micha, you are among the growing number of Israelis who have been making that trip to the Gulf states, I believe Doha in your case. What did you find there on that common ground?
I had an amazing visit last month. I met with someone from Oman, actually, and I asked him what needs to be done in order to promote normalization between Israel and the Gulf states, especially Oman. And he told me that we have no problem with an Israeli soldier killing a Palestinian terrorist. It's okay, it's part of the war. But when we see on the Arab media an Israeli bulldozer building settlements on Palestinian lands, that is something that we cannot bear. So until the settlements will stop, we cannot talk about full normalization, and that was very, very inspiring remark.
As a researcher,
by the way, in the same visit, I met some Qatari women, and they told me that Israel never had and never will be right to exist.
Interesting. So another a point of reality check. On that issue of settlements, as a researcher who's based in Israel, do you think that that's something that the Israeli government understands, that it's not all roses with the Gulf, that there is still this very big issue in the way?
I think that if Israel will continue to base its relations with Arab states, with Gulf states, only on common enemies, it will be a huge mistake, because in the dynamic reality of the Middle East, the nature and the extent of threat can change. For example, in 2014, ISIS was at the height of its power, and now its power is diminished. So if we take, for example, the Iranian threat, maybe it will change during days. So I think Israel should think about different ways to establish its relations with the Gulf states.
And not put all its eggs in one basket.
Well, Varsha, let's talk about that, because as Giorgio, for example, pointed out, there is no unity among the Gulf states. They have divisions. It's a region itself in conflict. That could be something that also could embroil Israel in situations where it may find itself uncomfortable.
Definitely, that is a very valid point. What we're seeing right now, what we have seen since last June when the Qatar crisis started, is a GCC that's very deeply split. And there isn't really policy convergence across many of the Gulf states. There's a lot more room for divergence in the GCC now than there is for shared positions. This could certainly affect Israel negatively in the sense that this position puts Gulf states more open to normalizing towards Israel. But at the same time, this could also, as you are saying, suck Israel into some rather messy intra-Gulf politics that Israel might not wish to take onto its plate right now. So as regards these moves that Israel is seeing from the Gulf states, these concessions, it's definitely going to be in the back of Israeli policymakers' mind, I'm sure, about how to thread a balance in a Gulf that is increasingly fractured like this.
All right, Varsha Kaduvayor in Washington, Giorgio Cafiero in Doha in Qatar, and Dr. Michal Yaari here with us in the studio.